Welcome to the podcast that discusses storytelling from all angles to help you and us answer the call when the muse screams, "Tell the damn story." We'll be exploring the challenges of being creative in fiction, illustration, comics, film, and nonfiction. All right, welcome to Tell the Damn Story. Alex Simmons and Tim Fielder are off in the Comic Con um, world in Atlantic City and Philly this week. Um, we're not sure. We haven't heard from the police yet, so things are going okay. And I cannot wait for them to come back and hear some of the stories about their adventures. If you go to the Tell the Damn Story Facebook page, you can see a lot of their antics. In the meantime, I'm holding down the fort, and it gives us an opportunity to talk about telling another damn story. Talk about the challenges of writing nonfiction. And with us today is a special guest star, Caseen Gaines. Let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Gaines. He is the author of not one, not two, but three nonfiction pop culture books. The first of which was Inside Pee-wee's Playhouse, the untold, unauthorized, and unpredictable story of a pop phenomenon. The second one was A Christmas Story, behind the scenes of a holiday classic, and coming out June 22nd, correct?
23rd, June 23rd.
I was a little ahead of myself. That's all right. It's a time-themed book. On June 23rd, we're going back to the future with We Don't Need No Roads, a look behind the scenes at Back to the Future. So welcome to Tell the Damn Story. Caseen Gaines, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks a lot for coming. Telling a nonfiction story, a completely different set of parameters. So I want to try and hear a little bit about each of those books, if you don't mind. Your first venture into nonfiction narrative was with the Pee Wee book. Um, how did you feel? How did you get the license? The the make the decision to say, you know what, I'm going to tell this guy's story.
Well, it was a really difficult decision to sort of go ahead and make this story into a book. I had never written a book before and was born the same year that Pee Wee's Playhouse was on television. So it's not something that I didn't work on the show or anything like that. But it was the more I spoke with people and the more I reached out to people that worked on the show, I realized that they had really interesting stories to tell. And as a fan of Pee Wee Herman's, I was interested in hearing them and almost started to feel an odd sense of guilt that no one else was able to hear these stories. I consider myself to be a pretty big fan, and so much of it was new information. Um, a lot of times, either because of PR reasons or just reasons of mythology, kind of pop culture stories get really boiled down to their simplest form, I think. There's always a story about this singer hearing a song and getting inspired in a diner, and then 15 minutes later writes the best rock song that's ever existed.
Right.
Um, I don't know how much validity there are in those stories, and I found that a lot of the mythos was not completely true on all three of my projects. So, wanting to sort of set the record straight and also celebrate these pop culture entities was really my main impetus.
But having read at least two of the books, the tone that comes across is celebratory and factual as opposed to gossipy and gotcha. There seems to be a reverence with the reverence, maybe too strong of a word, but that kind of respect for each of the titles. Why that rather than gossip? What are you offering that other people aren't?
Well, I think the main thing is audience is always something that is very present in my mind. I always want to write books that I would want to read as a fan. And so I want information, but I also want to celebrate the good work. I'm a fan of Pee Wee's Playhouse. I'm a fan of A Christmas Story. I'm a fan of Back to the Future. So I don't think the books shy away from, mild controversy, I guess you can say. But it's never presented in a way, or at least my goal is not to present it in a way where I'm being exploitative or anything like that. And a great example is in the Pee Wee Herman book, where there's over 250 pictures in that book. And one of the conversations we had was, do you run a picture of Paul Rubens' mugshot? It's a part of the Pee Wee Herman story.
Sure.
But we talk about it in the book, but there's no mugshot, and that really was for a couple of reasons. The first is that anyone who's interested and was around in 1991 has seen that image and doesn't need to see it again. And the other thing is that it's a book that's about the amazing, creative, and groundbreaking work that he did, and it seemed like almost a cheap shot to include the mugshot. Although one of the conversations was, are we not doing due diligence by not including it? Are we shying away from it? And the decision ultimately was no. That's not what people necessarily need to see, and it's available elsewhere if that's what you're interested in. But so there are lots of decisions like that get made.
Well, let me talk about since we brought Pee Wee up himself. Um, you can tell from the title, the unauthorized. Um, Pee Wee Herman himself, Paul Rubens, did not participate in this book, nor did he approve of it. How did you get around that?
One of the things that one of the first people I spoke to was a gentleman who was a puppeteer on the show. And he said to me at the end of our interview, "Did you speak to Paul?" And I said, "I haven't spoken to Paul Rubens yet." And he said, "Well, I actually have to give him a call about something else after this. Do you mind if I mention him the book and maybe he'll participate?" And the next day I got a letter from a lawyer. Um,
There's a participation for you.
yeah, so the message was communicated. But it was, again, one of the things that I stressed with Paul Rubens people repeatedly was, I'm investing this time and energy on this project not to get rich, but because, and certainly not to do any harm to his career, but to really celebrate and look at this moment. One of the things that surprised me was that the show had been around for 25 years, or had existed 25 years prior, and there was no book, there was no documentary, there was no television special. It seemed like such an important moment in pop culture, and Pee Wee Herman was everywhere for 5 or 6 years,
Right.
and I almost felt like he had been forgotten or his reputation had been sullied by the 1991 arrest. So I sort of wanted to help reestablish and remind people of that fantastic period of time in the mid 80s. So because I knew that I was operating from that position, even though I don't think I ever was effective in convincing Paul Rubens that was where I was coming from, I knew where my heart was and where the book
Right.
would ultimately fall.
And it seems from the amazing number of interviews you got from people um, either directly working on the TV show or somehow involved in his career, um, that a lot of people understood what you were doing. How many interviews did you get? That's amazing. And how did you go about first cracking the ice and getting the first couple of interviews? Was it just cold calling, cold emails? What was the deal?
It was that book was written almost entirely thanks to Facebook because I found people. It's amazing. I found people on Facebook that worked on the show either as puppeteers or actors, writers. I reached out to them. I let them know I was a fan, and at first it was just conversation. It was just I just want to let you know I enjoyed your show, and they really initiated conversations about, oh, it was so much fun. I still have great memories, and I just sort of asked, well, what's your favorite thing that you remember? Do you remember filming this episode or that episode? And I probably spoke casually with maybe 6 or 7 people before I even thought of doing anything with these conversations.
Right.
And it wasn't until you actually. I was speaking with you just about these conversations, and you said,
Full
well,
disclosure, we've known each other for a long
for a
time.
long time, yeah. So, and you said, well, what do you want to do with it? Do you want to do a blog or a podcast? I don't even think podcasting was in vogue, but I think you
No, we
had,
didn't know that then.
um, or a website or a book. And I said, I don't think I'm planning on doing anything with them. And you said, well, if you're interested in it, there's got to be other fans around the world that are interested in it. And that comment sort of stuck with me. And like I said, I sort of felt like I had this privilege of information that I wanted to share. So, zipping the story along, once I decided that I was going to do it, I reached out to more people and said, I'm writing a book. Again, I had no book deal. I had nothing but just,
Right.
I'm writing a book. I just spoke it
Well,
into existence.
I always thought you did most of this project because you wanted it to exist, and then worried about a book deal afterwards. And I would say that with all writers and all people who want to tell the damn story, to use the name of the show again, you have to start from there. You have to start from a position of I really need for this to exist, and I got that vibe from you. Um,
And I think
and
before
then
I even
the ball
knew,
was rolling.
sorry to cut you off, but I think before I even knew that I needed the story to exist, I think people, yourself, other people that I spoke to, realized in the way that I talked about these conversations
Yeah,
that I needed for the story to exist before I even realized it, and that
a
was,
lot of times that happens. Yeah,
yeah, and it
that's
was
great.
kind of cool. The story couldn't be contained, really. It seemed to become a force unto itself.
So I want to take you through a couple of questions about techniques. Again, people are looking, hopefully they're looking to figure out how to pursue their own passions. So you looked at credits on the show or credits on the DVD boxes, and then looked them up in Facebook and like that.
Right, that's what I did, and also maybe
Am
I
I
would.
giving away your trade secrets,
No, 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 no,
or
no,
you're
no.
creating your own competition now?
No, listen, I have no problem. I encourage people to go out and tell their damn stories too.
There you go.
So no, I looked at the end credits and just made a list for myself and saw who I could find.
Fantastic. So, minus Paul Rubens, you told the same story. There were a lot of quotes from Paul Rubens. Those were from publications. How did that work out?
Yeah, so the two big research phases for that book was interviews and then also a lot of secondary sources. I went to the library and pulled People Magazine and TV Guide and anything that had any sort of feature on Pee Wee's Playhouse. I found lots of scholarly journals. People talking about Pee Wee Herman as the man child and the id and all of the all of these sorts of things. Lots of things that were outside of the scope of what I needed for the book, but they were helpful. So there were a lot of secondary sources referenced too. I wanted Paul Rubens' voice to be present, even if he couldn't be present because he had spoken to me. So it was a
Right.
little bit of a challenge, but the goal, hopefully, people that have read it feel like he is present, even though I didn't speak with
Oh,
him.
I would argue that he is, and I would argue that one of the things that's most amazing about this is, if for people watching, this is your first book, and you take us there again and again to, whether it's the comics, was it the comic store where he started doing the
The
Pee Wee,
Groundlings out in L.A.
the Groundlings where he started doing the character, to as it develops, to the movies, to the TV show. Um, it's a fascinating read for anyone interested in pop culture, anyone interested in that particular fascinating American myth, the man child. Um, and I think you did a fantastic job. What did you learn from that prepared you for A Christmas Story?
Ooh, what I learned from that is, I guess pardon me, what I learned from both books is that each story is completely different and needs to be told in its own way. You need to serve your own individual story. So, one of the things that I tried to do with A Christmas Story, and that book was very challenging for me to write because I did all my interviews. Again, it was a similar process. I reached out to the actors and writers. Um,
Well, one of the challenges I would imagine is that you have a much smaller
Yes.
field of interviews because you went over all of Pee Wee's career. This is one film.
Right. I didn't even realize it until after the book was all done, but I maybe spoke to a dozen people for that Christmas story book. And they were in depth, and I spoke with them several times. I had longer
From a
interviews.
hundred to a dozen?
Yeah.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Which is, it was weird. And again, it was one of those things I didn't realize, um, but I tried for a long time to write it in the same vein as the Pee Wee Herman book. And for all the reasons that you just spoke about, there are different entities. You know, the Pee Wee Herman book was really almost a biography, you know, in a
Right,
sense.
right.
A Christmas Story wasn't. It was really about, you know, this film or this story that started from Gene Shepard's short stories and then made their way into film. So the approach was completely different. And one of the things that I hinged on as sort of a device for A Christmas Story was I tried to write each chapter as its own Christmas story, as its own short story almost.
Okay.
So there's a different protagonist with each chapter, and it, you know, it's loose. You know, that it was sort of a framework. I didn't hold myself
Right.
to it too stringently, but I tried to.
It's like a hook.
Right,
You know, you just
exactly.
got in that way. Yeah.
There's an opening anecdote. You follow that character. So if you're talking about filming, you sort of stay with one particular person and see it through their eyes, the
Right.
filming process for that chapter, and then we move on to a different person. Um,
Now, how did you decide on that narrative style?
I think it was through Gene Shepard. And for those who don't know, Gene Shepard is the person who was the writer of A Christmas Story, the film, and also the short stories that inspired the vignettes that make up the film. And through reading a lot of Gene Shepard and listening to a lot of Gene Shepard, I felt almost envious that Gene Shepard had the ability to tell his story in 20 pages as opposed to a 250 page book. And so
Right.
I said, well, I'll tell my story in a bunch of 25-page vignettes, much like he told his story. And you know, for people, it's funny because that was one of those things that I just sort of thought was for me, and I knew I had done it. But there are a couple of Gene Shepard enthusiasts that I had spoken to that sort of said that they felt like the narrative style of the book reminded them of Gene Shepard's short stories. It was maybe only
That's
two or three people
fantastic.
that have said that to me, but
I'll take it though, right?
yeah, no, believe me, it was great because that was something that was in my mind, and it made it easier for me to write because they were digestible pieces then.
Right. So you have from the avalanche of information that was Pee Wee Herman, because that project, 100 interviews, um, to a dozen. How do you decide who gets the focus? It was an ensemble film. You could always, on the Pee Wee thing, you could always go back, the focus is always on Pee Wee. Now, these 12, they weren't all the on screen persona, correct? It was all
Correct. They were
back.
mostly. I'm estimating, but I would say it was maybe three quarters were on air, and then the others were maybe not that much, but it was
You mean on screen?
on
Yeah.
screen. Right. The
Yeah.
majority were the actors, but there were also writers and producers and things like that.
And you contacted them the same way through Facebook and all that?
Yes, although I have to say, an interesting thing emerged with the Christmas Story book where the actors sort of unionized. I don't think that's an improper way of describing it. So I reached out to all of them individually, and some of them agreed, and some of them didn't rather. And what ended up happening was they decided it was going to be all or nothing, which was great for me because once I
Okay.
convinced them that this project had merit, they were all on board, and it was. They opened up their photo albums. They opened,
Oh, fantastic.
they volunteered to let me speak to their moms because their moms were on set, things like that. So it was really great in that regard. But so it sort of made it easy. Once I got them on board, they were fully in.
Did the having the Pee Wee book on your resume help break the ice?
I think so. And also, the difference is if you think about the timeline, I pitched the Christmas Story book to my publisher um, right after Pee Wee came out. So the reception was good. We got great reviews. And I said,
Right.
I want to do more. And they said, great. And then So I think the ball was rolling, as opposed to I already had a book deal before I spoke to my first person for A Christmas Story, as
Oh, that's
opposed to Pee Wee where there was a lot more cold calling and who are you and
right.
why are you talking to me?
Right. So, the work helps lead to the other work, it always the situation. Um, the difference, another difference between the Pee Wee and the Christmas Story is that in Pee Wee Herman, everybody who was working on that, uh, or the vast majority, were adults who had pursued that career. Most of the people you were talking here had done it when they were children, and a lot of them hadn't continued in entertainment. Was that a roadblock?
Um, it wasn't a roadblock actually, but it was an interesting difference. Because with Pee Wee, I found that people were really excited to talk to me because they hadn't spoken about Pee Wee's Playhouse in 20 years in some cases. And also because of the persona of Pee Wee Herman, a lot of them had never spoken about Pee Wee's Playhouse. If you're getting an interview, you're not getting an interview with the puppeteer. You're asking Paul Rubens for an interview, going back to the
Right.
80s. The difference with A Christmas Story, like you mentioned, a lot of these actors really. They weren't talked to death about it at this point. It was still sort of fresh and new in a story that they were still sort of in awe of themselves. And with A Christmas Story, I have to say, they all understood immediately the appeal of the book, and I think that was the difference
Right.
with Pee Wee too. People with Pee Wee sort of said, is anyone going to read this? This was a long time ago. People have sort of forgotten about us. But
Right.
with A
But A
Christmas
Christmas
Story,
Story has evolved from a movie that may not have hit the mark when it first came out
right?
to this cult classic that people look forward to every year. So it seems to me that everyone would understand that this would have perennial appeal,
Complete
as a
opposite
book.
trajectory. Pee Wee was huge for 5 years and then tapered off, whereas
Right.
this was a non-entity until about maybe 10 years ago, and then has slowly been picking up.
Amazing. Amazing. You also had some adventures in promoting the book and that kind of stuff. Um, how was it that your involvement with the cast members and the book went on after publication? How talk about that a little bit,
Well,
because we don't really get to talk about promotion that much on this show.
yeah, it's
Usually we're about create the creation of it.
and it's part of telling the story too. It's funny because one of the arguments, not I shouldn't say arguments, so one of the conversations that always comes up right before the book comes out is what's the PR plan? And I'm of the mindset that I want to go out and meet as many people as possible and be in bookstores and sign books. And I know that I might go to a bookstore and I had an event in Cleveland once where I sold maybe 6 books, and that's a long hike for 6 books from
Yes, it
the New
is.
York area where we are. But I want to go out and tell my story of writing these books and make the sell, to people
Right.
directly. So one of the things that happened with A Christmas Story was the actors were all sent an early copy of the book, and one by one emailed or called and said, "Yeah." I had one actor tell me, I always regretted having not keeping a diary um, during the making of this film, and now I have my diary. Reading
Oh,
reading your
fantastic.
book, makes me feel like I have everything on record now. And so when it was time to promote the book, they were enthusiastic. More than one of them said people need to read the book. And so
Right.
whatever helps to get people to read it, we'll go to bookstores, we'll go to conventions, and I had several events with the cast members of A Christmas Story in near Buffalo, New York, and Pittsburgh, and in the Chiller Theater Convention in New Jersey. And we went to Chicago. Ian Petrella and I went to Chicago a couple of times, and it was great fun. And it's great for the fans too because they get to interact with this story in a different sort of way. Now it's not just that 24-hour marathon.
Now that's it's kind of amazing in and of itself, but linking the three together, you have this bright star, short-lived bright star, who it was reviving right around the time you were coming out with the book. You have this kind, almost a myth that is slowly growing to a cult, and then your segue is to inarguably the big leagues. You know, the Back to the Future trilogy, unquestionably a hit, unquestionably big Hollywood. Most of the actors, this was one project in long careers. A whole, I would imagine, a whole new set of problems
It
for
was,
you.
yeah, it was, I felt like a dog chasing a car with the Back to the Future book. I wanted,
Really, well, like a DeLorean? Were you chasing
yeah,
a DeLorean?
exactly, exactly. I wanted to write this book so badly, and then I was blessed with a book deal, and then I went, wow, now I have to tell this damn story, you know, and it was so hard to figure out, you know, with A Christmas Story, it's one film and 200 something pages. Then I'm consolidating three films into that same length with what I think is inarguably a much more complicated story and a much more interesting story, frankly. I mean, you know, between Eric Stoltz originally being cast in Michael J. Fox's part, the film, you know,
That was before it was Michael J. Fox's part.
right, that's right, exactly before it was Michael J. Fox's part. You know, just the story of the making of Back to the Future is so complicated, and I had no idea how I was going to consolidate all of this into my
Well,
word
this
count.
trilogy was originally a one and done, right?
Right. Yeah, and then it was the biggest hit of 1985 in America. It was the third largest hit of 1985 worldwide. And so, because of that, Universal said, "You're making another film. We're making another film. Would you like to? Would you like to make it along with us?" And so it became this trilogy. But it was a very hard thing, and what made it so much easier for me was the early support of Bob Gale, who is one of the co-creators, him along with Robert Zemeckis. They cooked up this idea for Back to the Future, and Bob Gale was the writer of all three films. He was the producer of all three films. Um, because of his support and because he was so helpful in getting interviews with people, and there were some people that denied, that rejected me when I asked for an interview, and then Bob Gale made a phone call, and then they were available for me. And so the biggest difference with Back to the Future was I didn't
You
spend.
don't want to name those people, though, do you?
No, no, no. But because ultimately, I mean, ultimately they you know they came around and it was great. And listen, I understand they talk about this film a lot, so you know you have to be
Right.
selective. I get it.
Sure.
But the biggest difference with these projects was for my first two books, I never had the ability to speak to the the creative center, the creative core of the project. I didn't get a chance to speak with Paul Rubens. And with A Christmas Story, well, I spoke with almost everyone who was still alive. The director and the writer had both passed away.
Right.
So because of that, you know, maybe they would have participated, but you know, I don't know. So I didn't have
Couldn't
the
do it.
access to them. But
Right.
having a lot of the stars, a lot of the all of the creative people behind Back to the Future, um, it was fantastic, and it was so helpful because I could pinpoint the exact day that certain things happened because they still had records. So there are times where I, you know,
Wow.
reference, you know, January 23rd, you know, 1985 or whatever the case may be. I mean, I have the exact day that Eric Stoltz was let go, the exact day Michael J. Fox was hired, and when those decisions were made. So I think it really helped the book.
Now, did Stoltz or Fox talk to you?
I had a, you know, the weird thing with, well, first of all, Eric Stoltz, that's a quick no. I made lots of
But
requests.
understandable.
Yeah,
Understandable,
you
though.
know, and Eric Stoltz kind of famously once was on the Today Show or something, and or Good Morning America, and he was being asked about a film that he was in. This was maybe just a couple of years ago, and the first question was, do you mind if I just ask you about Back to the Future? And his response on screen was, you have no idea how difficult it is being asked about a job that you were let go from for 30 years of your life. I don't want that to be
Yeah,
my first
yeah,
question every time I
sure,
sit down
sure.
with someone.
And he had a career. He was successful, so
Yeah. So
not
Eric
it's
Stoltz,
not the center of the book.
right? No, it's
Michael
not.
J. Fox, on the other hand,
Michael J. Fox, that this is a unfortunate situation with scheduling, and it kills me. But at the time that I started working on this book, Michael J. Fox was working on his NBC show, the Michael J. Fox Show, and
hmm
then so I knew that he was filming. I reached out. I was told, he's interested, but he's busy working on the show. I reached back out a couple months later, and it was 2 days before they announced that the show had been canceled.
ouch.
So the timing wasn't good on that front. And then by the time we kind of synced up, we were sort of too far along in the like. There wouldn't have been a way to insert him in the narrative.
Right.
So that's a shame. But I spoke with Christopher Lloyd and Leah Thompson and Huey
Well,
Lewis.
let's talk about Christopher Lloyd.
Yes,
We'll get to Leah Thompson in a second.
I love Leah
But
Thompson.
very quickly, Christopher Lloyd. What kind of interview?
Christopher Lloyd was a great interview. He was surprisingly a little deprecating. He talked about not being aware of whether or not he was doing a good job on Back to the
Wow.
Future. Working every day and trying to earn his laughs, and Back to the Future was well into his career, but still feeling nerves and trepidation. Um, and but he was great, and one of the things that was great about his interview was that he said. Now, he never knew if he was doing a good job on the Back to the Future films, but now if he sees it on TV, he can't help but watch it, even though he doesn't like watching himself on screen. So he knows that the movie's good. So it was kind of
Okay.
a nice thing to work into that interview. But he was great. It was, I mean, talking to Christopher Lloyd, that's amazing.
I know. Yes, and let's indulge for a second. The Heavenly Leah Thompson. How was that?
I am a big fan of Leah Thompson's.
I love that woman.
As everyone who knows me knows, I'm a big fan of hers, and it was number one. She was just so cool. I mean, it was she immediately. It was a very comfortable conversation. When I spoke with Christopher Lloyd, it's Christopher Lloyd, and I
Christopher
had a
Lloyd.
lot of
Yes, Christopher Lloyd.
reverence for him. But with Leah Thompson, she was so comfortable and casual, and I thought very, very candid in a way that I really appreciated. One of the great quotes in this book is she mentioned that as great as the Back to the Future trilogy is in her memory, it reminds her that there's always good and bad in life, and that she was a great friend of Eric Stoltz. She was a
hmm
great friend of Crispin Glover. Crispin Glover didn't participate in the second two films,
Right.
or second three films rather, or second and third film. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Right. I got you
And
all three times.
and so she said, it's there wasn't a day where she didn't show up for work where she didn't have a little bit of sadness for her friends that had been that were no longer on this production, and that she
Sure.
loves the films, but it's a bittersweet memory for her still. And I just thought that was such a nice piece of candor. And doesn't take away from the films at all. It's an honest human reaction.
How did you what choices did you need to make in writing the narrative of this particular book?
One of the things that, and this was included in the pitch for Back to the Future, but I always knew that the story was not the story of Michael J. Fox. The story was the story of Bob Zemeckis and Bob Gale, these two filmmakers that met in college and worked on each other's senior theses, and had two films that were unsuccessful at the box office, and then struck gold with this film.
Right.
And so to me, that was the narrative, and everything that we experience is through the lens of how it impacted Bob and Bob. So that was important. And then also, from an editorial choice, we decided pretty early on that all of the quotes that appear in the book were going to be primary sourced. So they're all quotes that come from my conversations with people. There's no quotes that are from
From secondary.
journals or articles or things like that.
Major style change for you for this third book. Did you miss leaning on that secondary source material?
Uh, sure, I did, but it made me work harder,
Excellent.
and it was something that I thought I thought benefited the work because it sort of kept the quotes consistent. You didn't
Mm-hmm.
have, for me, the goal was to make the reader forget that they were reading a work of nonfiction, if that makes any sort of
Right.
sense. So, I took artistic liberty. Everything's factual, but I took art. I called up the editor once. The opening anecdote, it starts in the editing room, and so I called up Arthur Schmidt, who also Academy Award winner for Forrest Gump,
Right.
and asked him, "Do you remember what the layout of the editing room was like? Where your desk was, and where your file cabinets were, and were you organized?" And he said, "Oh, sure. I spent as many hours in there. There was always the smell of cardboard. We had these cardboard file cabinets, so there was."
Fantastic.
And so there's all this description in the book that people reading it might go, well, how does he know it smelled like cardboard in there? But
It's because the people who were there told you.
yeah, and I set that up in the introduction. I say, that I I don't present anything in the book as speculation. If there were things that were speculation, I either left them out or I said so and so says this,
Right.
person B says that. But everything is presented as fact, and I feel confident in that because everything is well corroborated. I mentioned in the introduction, sort of my rules that there's a difference between organic dialogue, you and I talking, and then there being a transcription, versus remembered dialogue. But there's validity in the remembered dialogue because it's still someone's impression of that moment, and that's almost as valid as truth because everyone's truth is different.
Fantastic.
So that was all, and the sort of the connective tissue for diehard Back to the Future fans is the script for Back to the Future 2 and 3 starts with a Soviet proverb that says the only thing more uncertain than the future is the past. And the
Excellent.
book starts with that same quote before I talk about the things that I just mentioned to you.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. All right, we have one last question for you. Best piece of advice you can give to aspiring nonfiction writers.
Tell the story that's interesting to you. Because if it's interesting to you, it's probably interesting to other people. Um, we are naturally people are naturally good storytellers. Whether you're telling a story about what happened at work or what happened in a television episode that you're recounting to someone else, and so trust your own ability to tell a good story. And if you do that and you really work at telling the best story that you can, I think others will be attracted to it as well.
Fantastic. Caseen Gaines, where can people find you and your work?
I'm available at CaseenGaines.com. That's CASEENGAINES.com. I'm also on Facebook at Facebook.com/CaseenGaines, same spelling, and on Twitter at Caseen Gaines. All my books are on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and wherever books are sold.
Fantastic. And whether it's fiction or nonfiction, ladies and gentlemen, at a certain point you have to sit down and tell the damn story. We'll see you next time. If you want to hear more about the show or any of us, go to tellthedamnstory.com.